Protecting officers physically and enhancing their safety on the road are just a few of the important tenets of officer safety and wellness. In this next session, we'll talk about wellness and the many pieces that make it up. More than physical fitness, wellness involves your emotional health, nutritional health, and the ability to cope with the tremendous pressures of being a police officer in today's world. Learning to be resilient and to avoid the problems caused by stress are keys to helping officers maintain their well-being. Among the many causes of death recorded by the National Law Enforcement Memorial, cardiac-related incidents, stroke, and exposure to hazardous materials are among the highest. Today, law enforcement faces many challenges. The impact of recent events with the negative stereotypes of police officers, coupled with the pandemic, has made wellness a priority. In this session, we will hear about the importance of being proactive, about your cardiac health and diet. We'll learn how agencies are coping with alcoholism, stress, and what they're doing to reduce the risk of COVID in their officers and among their jail staff. The National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum is also a partner in the Safe Leo Project, which is developing new training regimens that address the high rate of suicide within law enforcement.
The first thing I just wanted to kind of expound on what you're saying is, we look to save lives, we look to keep names off the wall, and there's certain things that are low-hanging fruit. There's things that we can get very easily. And to kind of put this in perspective, I want to just set the stage here so the other panelists and the listeners understand what we're looking at. Heart disease may come in on the Officer Down Memorial page, or as a death is the number 2 or number 3 item every year. However, that doesn't capture the heart attacks that happen off duty, and it doesn't capture the heart attacks that are not fatal. So when someone has a cardiac event, they have a heart attack, the conditions that put that plan in motion didn't start at the moment that individual had a heart attack. It started months, weeks, days, hours before the heart attack occurred. There's nothing magical after that 6 p.m. shift ends or that 8 p.m. shift ends when that individual officer leaves, that their heart attack risk stays at the office with them. You can look at the death for pursuit and gunfire and all the other things that we come in, the occupational hazards that we are, that have that drops off rather precipitously. But heart attacks don't. So when you extrapolate the data that we collect and you extrapolate for a 24-hour period and realize that we're capturing 3% of the heart attacks, this is a substantial issue. And it's so substantial that if you look at the frequency of heart attacks, the average age of a cop with a heart attack, we used to believe was 49. New data published earlier this year shows it's down to 46. A large chunk, up to 45%, happen under the age of 45. And if you look at our life expectancy, it's 22 years less than the general population. A cop's life expectancy in the United States is 57 compared to 79. And the terrible thing is, the average age of retirement of a law enforcement officer is 57. So that is the scope of the problem. So it's one thing to talk about what the issue is. The second thing is to talk about why we see the issue. And then, of course, the third thing is, how do we prevent this from happening? Because that's the focus here, is keep these names off the wall. Why does this happen disproportionately to this group of people? The quite honest answer is we don't really know. We have some ideas. First off, it is an interesting stress pattern. So people will ask me all the time as I travel all over the country and I sit on the officer safety working groups regarding this, and they say, it's cops are under stress. And I tell you, we're under stress as cops, we're under stress as doctors and nurses and people who deliver pizza. This is a stressful time. Everybody's under stress. But our stress pattern in law enforcement is different. We have a pattern which is 98% boredom, followed by 2% sheer terror. And when that adrenaline kicks in, whether it's physical from a use of force, whether it's emotional when a call comes in, an officer down, when it's during a high-speed pursuit, certain physiological changes happen. There's a rapid increase in heart rate and blood pressure. There's repeated valsalva, in which the officer bears down without breathing. Those of us who've gone through defensive tactics will very well remember, as we do it, the instructors are typically yelling, breathe, breathe, because it's common for us not to. You have a conversion from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism, and you're using both sides of your body, left and right hemispheres of your brain, and your upper and lower body. So all these things are engaging at once. The adrenaline dump makes the plaque in the arteries unstable, which leads to heart attack. So we have that risk. You put that on top of a group of people who most of the civilians don't realize it's a very sedentary profession. It's a diet of convenience, and especially in departments that are busy. It's shift work, and all these things lead to an increase in obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, and prediabetes. And you take that risk and you throw on top of it those adrenaline dumps, and it's a recipe for disaster. The differentiation has to be made between whether you're doing an exercise test to test fitness and functional capacity, or a stress test to look for blockages. They're completely separate issues. So a stress test, a treadmill stress test, looking at an EKG, is not a good cardiac assessment for people who are not having symptoms. However, we do know that we do need fitness assessments. And then the question which was earlier raised is, how do you do a fitness assessment? Is it a standard military type fitness assessment in which you do push-ups, sit-ups, and a 1.5-mile run? Is it a obstacle or agility course? In Texas, the Texas DPS has really validated the Concept 2 rower as a tremendous device for testing exercise potential, because there's very low injury rate on it. They're actually quoting as almost zero. And it simulates those things that I mentioned. It simulates aerobic to anaerobic transition. It simulates Valsalva. It simulates rapid increase in heart rate, blood pressure, and use of the upper and lower bodies. And the troops will argue when we put these things in that, we don't row after bad guys. And then the response is, well, we don't do push-ups and sit-ups and, 1.5-mile run after bad guys either. But the reality is, if we set up probably the most effective type of fitness assessment is an agility course, which has obstacles that a patrol officer would come in contact with on a regular basis. It's effective, but the problem is you have a large group of people who don't train for it, who come out on the day of testing, and there's a tremendous amount of pulled hamstrings, twisted ankles, and whatnot that we see on that. So the treadmill is a decent test. It's a fitness test, but again, the differentiation is it is not something we recommend for a cardiac screen to identify anyone who has a cardiac problem. These tests are phenomenal tests for fitness assessments. And I just want to add one more thing, John, if I may. If we have a fitness assessment which is placed in service to a department, it's got to have either a consequence or a reward. A fitness assessment that just says, go out and take this assessment, I've seen those tests operate, they're useless. There's no incentive. But if you tell the folks, hey, if you do well on this fitness test, we'll give you a little medal. Cops love all the shiny medals. We'll give you an extra $50 to $100 in your pocket every month. If you don't make it, well, we'll remediate you. If you can't make a remediation, we're going to talk about a fitness for duty, because there's a certain amount of fitness requirement it takes to do this job. So again, they're all good tests when applied properly.
I think the key piece to all of it is never forgetting that physical and emotional health are flip sides of the same coin. They are not distinct from each other. And I think sometimes we look at that. And so for me, in terms of mitigating a lot of those issues, there are 3 places where you can actually work to prevent negative outcomes. It's before something happens, while something is happening, and after something happens. And those all take slightly different pieces. So before something happens, that's what we in psychology typically call resilience. It's the idea that I am giving myself the tools and ability so that when something happens, I can get through it a little bit easier. And that pulls in a lot of the stuff Dr. Scheinberg was talking about. If my body is healthy, that gives me a step up. So if I'm eating well and I'm sleeping well and I'm staying physically active, all of that will help me to better handle things like adrenaline dumps and stuff like that. So prior, you want to be really doing everything that you can. And then, as he said, that's of course much easier said than done. And so it is important that there's a lot of departments who are actively looking at wellness programs to help officers. Things like helping them plan so that instead of it being convenience eating, I think at the beginning of the day, can I make some sandwiches for myself? Can I put some fruit in my trunk? What are some simple things that I can do that will help me through that day? So that's kind of that prevention piece. When it's actually during an event, this is when we start relying on a lot of the techniques actually that officers learn and don't realize they're learning when they learn things like de-escalation. Things like taking a breath, taking a step back, remembering your goal in being there, remembering the purpose, and that the person that you're talking to is a human, right? And keeping all of that in mind, and so we're better able to handle exactly what's happening in that moment. And then, of course, after the fact, that's when we're dealing with both the physical side of it. So I've had that huge adrenaline dump. My body has to process all of that. So I'm processing the physical side of it, which I'll leave to Dr. Scheinberg to talk about, but then also the emotional side of it. What did I see? What did I experience? What can I do with that? And there are a lot of agencies who are working on that as well. Different ways setting up peer support, just letting folks know that they're there. When I teach classes with law enforcement, a lot of what I talk about in my trauma section is watching for changes in other people and then being open to it if someone comes up to you and says, hey, I'm a little concerned. It seems like you're acting differently than you did before. It's very, very difficult. I'm obviously not law enforcement, but I am a veteran, and it's very similar mindset, suck it up, buttercup, right? So if somebody says something to you that they're concerned, what is our typical response? Oh, no, man, I'm fine. Being open to hearing that from somebody and being willing to say that to somebody, offline, not making necessarily a big deal about it, but being there for each other, because we are our own best resources. For officers, helping them to understand that they don't have to buy into the us versus them, because that's what that boils down to. It really does. And it makes sense how that develops, because you're seeing people on their worst days. So of course, over time, you start to develop, or can start to develop, this idea that there's this disconnect between you and the people that you're serving. And so if I really start to internalize that, then it becomes an us versus them. And it is that warrior culture. We can do no wrong. I'm just protecting my brothers and sisters in arms is essentially what can develop. And that isn't really very healthy. And so one of the things that's becoming more and more in the news is talking about accountability, talking about giving officers the skills, because it is a skill, but also the permission to be able to step up and say, I saw something I didn't agree with, without being put on suspension, without being fired, that sort of thing. And then related, but a separate question, the second part of what that the person asked, having to do with women and people of color, that a lot has to do with our implicit biases. Sometimes it's explicit, but often it's implicit. And I've actually been teaching, including with John, teaching on implicit bias for years. Everybody has implicit bias. So teaching law enforcement officers that they are not unique, that they have implicit bias just like everyone else does, but looking at how do I bring it to the light so that I can mitigate it, so that I can actually make choices not based on an implicit bias, but that I can objectively explain why I made the choice I did, why I stopped the person I did, why I arrested the person I did, that kind of thing. So there's two pieces to it, but a big part of it is coming from leadership, letting the folks with their boots on the ground know that it is okay to acknowledge that we are all in this together and we all have these difficulties and we have to work together to solve them.
officer safety and wellness section thrives itself on protecting our officers and sort of building up resilience, if you will. Police work is very stressful. When we first started this initiative, we realized that a lot of our officers who've been involved in critical incidents, whether it be a shooting or on the scene of a traumatic event, had never had counseling to manage that stress. And as a result, they start to medicate themselves and in a lot of cases, over-medicate themselves with alcohol. So alcoholism was high in the Baltimore City Police Department. So through the leadership of Commissioner Harrison, he has allowed us to identify those officers and get them into an alcohol program and not be penalized for voluntarily going to this program and being out of the workplace for sometimes 30 days. We've had more than 50 officers to voluntarily enter into these programs. They receive inpatient treatment, they use FMLA leave, and they transition back to their old jobs and they're not penalized. They don't get an internal affairs number, anything like that. So it's been very successful. What we have started doing in Baltimore is that if an officer is involved in a critical incident, whether it's a police officer involved shooting or, we've had our detectives that found deceased kids in trash bins and things of that nature, we will deploy a peer support member to that officer. And before that officer goes home, that officer will get a mental health debriefing that talks about post-traumatic stress disorder and will give them recommendations that they can do if they go home and they can't sleep or they are eating too much or not eating enough, that might be signs of early post-traumatic stress disorder. The one thing we don't want them to do is rely on alcohol. We want them to call their counselor back. We want them to be active physically. We want them to eat nutritional meals, but we're doing everything to turn back the tides of our suicides. In 2014, we had several suicides, and one officer committed suicide with her own duty weapon after she was reinstated back to the department. So that is a serious issue that we're trying to address. One of my lieutenants broached me with this idea. I'm from old school. I'm like, oh my gosh, we're going to lose our credibility if we introduce these officers to therapy dogs. But I got to tell you, the first time that I saw one of our officers engaging one of our therapy dogs, it was almost like their whole perception and their whole emotions changed instantly. And it may have been just for 5 or 10 minutes by spending time with this therapy dog, but 5-10 minutes of a relief from stress is something that if we can give that to our officers, we'll do that. So anything like therapy dogs, we have pop-up health fairs where our officers engage with professionals in the mental health field, in the financial management field, in the nutrition field, any and everything that we can do, physical fitness, to engage our officers in building resiliency while they're police officers. We're willing to try anything. So a therapy dog was one of the things that we have done and we continue to do. We want to make sure that our officers survive this thing called police work. And when they retire, that they're just as healthy as they were when we hired them.
At the Appleton Police Department, we have established a peer support system that has been in place since 2014. Essentially became a collaborative effort in Outagamie County, where there's about 28 members that are peer supporters, which includes about 9 police agencies in Outagamie County. The idea behind it was to bring together a group of individuals that share the same or the common interest in helping other officers or family members of officers that just wanted to process anything that they might have been struggling with, or just kind of bounce back ideas about things that they might be having difficulties with, and have a person of support for them to be able to do it in a way that maintain anonymity and also just created a space where it was safe to talk about things that were difficult for folks. We've been in operation again since 2014, and throughout that time, we've been able to accomplish different things, and we've added different layers to our program. Now, for example, we have mental health providers that work with our police department and provide wellness checks for our officers on a yearly basis. We also have continue to expand on our physical assessment test, which is once a year we're able to participate that and receive incentives for maintaining our physical well-being. In addition to that, as part of our peer support, we have been able to bring a wellness committee and form this group of folks that sort of specialize in looking into other ways in how we can get our police officers connected to resources that address mental health concerns or the physical concerns, the spiritual concerns, anything that has to do with the pillars that we have created at the police department. The one thing too that is pretty unique about our peer support system is that we are available 24/7. Essentially, we have our personal numbers included as a resource for these officers. We have explored our chaplain program, which has been pretty cohesive and pretty strong in our police department. And in addition to that, we have allowed for some of these tragic incidents we as peer supporters to plug in ourselves into that process. For example, we've had a couple of tragic incidents in our community, and in those moments, we've had the layout as to how to respond to these tragedies and provide immediate support for our officers that are involved in the process, or officers that were sort of working that day, for example, and also how to connect with them. So it's been a program that is very fluid. It keeps evolving, and it's very exciting to see as to where we're headed with it. Of course, there's a lot of work to do still, and yet that's the beautiful opportunity that we still have a lot of folks that are interested in continuing this journey and being able to be there for our officers and their families.
In first day of the new academy orientation, we introduced the wellness unit, all of the resources, psychological, chaplain, we have a family resource team, and then we go ahead and train at the academy. We do a 6-hour block of emotional survival based on Kevin Gilmartin's book, and it's set up in 3 different 2-hour increments. We do another 2-hour class on alcohol and substance abuse and the ways that we can develop healthier coping mechanisms and avoid that situation. We have officers, I bring officers in that tell their stories, some that have lost their jobs and some that haven't, and all of which have found a solution in not drinking and developing coping mechanisms better. We've implemented the mindful meditation series. One of my sergeants in here picked that up. The busiest stations that before COVID hit, which stopped everything in its tracks, but we started doing meditation at lineups before officers broke and went out into the field. So we had 15-minute guided meditations that helped to reduce the stress and get people more, get our officers in a center point instead of a high point. So when they go out to the field, they're not all keyed up already. They're in a better state of stasis, so to speak. So we have that. Another thing that's been very impactful and helpful for our employees is that we've streamlined, for those who need to go in for alcohol or substance abuse, I make one phone call and I'm set up with law enforcement or first responders only treatment centers, and that's been really good since the beginning. In 2011, we had a lot of, first there weren't that many of those providers. Now there's tons of them. It's become I think a very lucrative business, but we still had to deal through the politics and the process of the city, which is a lot of times having to call your insurance, go get approved and all of this. We've eliminated that. So if you came to me today and said, Deanna, I think I need outpatient treatment, or I think I need inpatient, I can usually get somebody in within 24 hours without the officers having to do any facilitation on their own with insurance or anything else. So that's been big. We host many outside agencies. We've had Western Australia here, we've had Chicago NAMI, just to name a few, a lot of outside agencies coming to investigate our program and take what they can and learn from us, because we've had 11 years to work on this. And we also realize that, we can help anybody with our ideas, but it's not necessarily going to work in their culture. And you take what you can, you throw it on the wall. If it sticks, that's wonderful. If not, you find another avenue to address the needs of your organization. I'm seated in our office, which you can see partially that it's somewhat of a living room type setting. We have created that purposefully so that when people come in here, they feel like they can relax and just enjoy a more familiar or comfortable setting. And that's important because we want people to feel like they can let down their guard a little bit. And it's been very successful in that respect. So approximately 1,800 sworn personnel, 700 civilians, all of which are represented under the umbrella of wellness, which consists of focused psychological services, who we've worked with since 1991. They are an amazing group, approximately 12 clinicians and therapists. They're very culturally competent in working with law enforcement, which makes it a win-win for everybody all the way around. They are underneath our umbrella of wellness, as is our peer support team, which is approximately 100 members strong. We have 3, if you wish to call them subsections. We have our officer-involved peer support, officer-involved shooting peer support team, which consists of officers who either had the unfortunate experiences having an in-custody death or having had taken someone's life. Those officers not only go through our post-mandated 3-day training class, which all of our peer support members do, but they also have specified training in dealing with the aftermath of an officer-involved shooting, and are there to, for instance, if we do have a shooting, we have 1 officer paired with each shooter, so 1 peer support per person, and then all the witness officers also will have a peer support OIS team member, and they'll guide them through the process and provide follow-up support. Then we have our chaplain team, which is amazing, and they're chaplains, but they provide the support that a peer does, but with an added layer of, comfort and spirituality if needed by the officer, but it's never pushed. We have our general peer support, which is made up of all of our population, sworn, civilian, who provide support from their own personal experiences. I don't think there's anything that's not covered. We also have our communications division. The dispatchers have their own peer support team. All 3 peer support teams fall underneath the wellness unit. So we provide their training, support, etc. Chaplains are, even though they're the chaplain entity of our group, they're still a large part of peer support and developing wellness within our population here.
Everybody has their own frustrations in every job, and for my communications folks, especially the 911 operators, one of the things they found to be most distressing, most frustrating, was what we call the nuisance calls. The person calling because their kid won't listen to them, or somebody calling up and complaining because they didn't get what they wanted at a fast food restaurant. Any myriad of these calls that they get all day, and 1 or 2, not a big deal. You get a host of them, and it becomes, for a lot of people, it becomes very trying and very frustrating. And what we found rather interesting, and what I hear from a lot of folks, is on Thanksgiving Day, it was the day they look forward to the least. And I thought, what's going on Thanksgiving that's so, apart from having to work on Thanksgiving, is so bothersome? And apparently, the number 1 call they'd get every single Thanksgiving morning was, how do you defrost a turkey quickly? Because they woke up Thanksgiving morning, somebody forgot to take the turkey out a few days before, and that was the problem. And so we laughed about that a little bit, and I just said, okay, let's see how many turkey calls you can get in a day, and whoever does wins a frozen turkey. And we made it a game, because what I found growing up, and what I found with a lot of the issues, things that frustrated me in life, was if I made it a game, I kind of reframe what we're doing. I made it more enjoyable. I made it less of a problem, less of a burden on myself or the people around me. And so we did that with the turkey, and it became such a success. We went back and I asked them, what are the nuisance calls? Give me the categories of nuisance calls. And they came up with a host of different categories, and we put them on bingo cards. You can go online and just type in, make your own bingo cards. If you supply 25, 30 terms, you can come up with a host of these for free. So we had nuisance call bingo. and we just passed them out to everybody. And you could have 5 cards, and every card you'd get a bigger and bigger prize. And what we found was people started enjoying getting the nuisance calls, or when they get one, they look up on their list and kind of hope for that one. So now we took this thing that was frustrating, that was causing people anguish, and made it something fun every day. We reframed in their mind what this call meant from every day.
We know that part of being safe is having a good frame of mind and being able to make good, sound decisions. And we don't always do that when we're stressed or somehow we're struggling. It could be emotionally. And whether it's at work or it's at home, we talk about the need to reduce suicides in the profession because of the stresses. But the reality is if we really begin to look at the root causes and we can get to this early, it really is about how can we do more self-assessments in the area of wellness. So wellness is a part of safety. So I embarked a few years ago with Dr. Black and Cortico to do something for my agency, and that is to create an app, a place where every officer could download an app on their phone and actually be able to research and assess through vetted best practices and self-assessment tests to determine whether or not they're at risk and to get information on how to get help. There are many things that are available to the officers and first responders and family on the app. Officer wellness toolkits, self-assessments, therapist finder. You literally can open up a piece of the app and a map will show a vetted, trusted therapist where at a click of a button, you could actually make an instant connection with someone who's been trusted with their resume that says these are our expertise, and the ability to reach out immediately so that you can feel comfortable in what they can provide. There's all kinds of other information that's in there in assessments, but best practice information on sleep, on nutrition, on fitness, all the things that we're trying to look at that creates the overall wellness of our first responders.
Stockton, California has long been considered a city with a high crime rate. But during the recession of 2007, things got even worse. The city filed for bankruptcy, forcing the police department to cut 99 police officer positions and more than 90 civilian and part-time positions, all while the violent crime rate was skyrocketing. The department had its first line of duty death in 20 years and suffered through a horrific shootout with armed bank robbers, which had a lasting impact on members of the police department and the community. In addition to that, firearm assaults on police officers were up 400%. The stress of working in such a violent environment took a toll on the department. Many officers left to go to other agencies, and morale was sinking. To better meet the needs of its employees, the Stockton Police Department created a wellness network, a preventative and holistic approach to officer wellness by building resiliency through family support, exercise and diet, and faith. Wellness Network members respond to all officer-involved shootings and incidents involving injured officers. Psychological services are available for all employees and their immediate families free of charge. Ongoing training and workshops are offered to employees and their families to help alleviate stress and create a strong support network. And a CrossFit gym was opened with the Stockton Police Officers Association to provide opportunities for better fitness and nutrition. The program has been a huge success, and the Stockton Police Department continues to improve the safety and wellness of its officers and their families, while also forming better relationships with the communities they serve.
As we close out this session on wellness, we felt it was essential to hear from some of our experts about policing during the pandemic.
There's a heightened level of stress across the entire country right now due to COVID and social unrest. And so officers are going to be lightning rods for some of that. And that it is going to be natural that that's going to be stressors for them. To speak specifically to the idea of the concern for the family and for family members being worried about their law enforcement officers who are out there potentially being exposed, first is take a deep breath, recognize it is perfectly normal to be concerned about that. I think we all have some level of concern about that, and I think that that's normal. Where we want to be careful is not allowing it to pile on and bury everything else. Both the families and the officers themselves handle all the regular risks. You know the things to do. Your agencies are putting systems in place to help you protect yourselves and to protect your families. So there's two pieces to it. One is follow that guidance and trust that each side will do the best that they can for it, and then recognize that's all that you can do. You may or may not get it, your family may or may not get it, but, and I don't want to get too far into like statistics or any of that kind of stuff, but it's not any greater of a risk to some degree than any of the other risks that you're already handling. You can do this, you just have to remind yourself that you can.
We don't understand more than we understand. We don't understand full transmission. We don't understand why some people who are 30 years old and healthy die from it, and other people who are 75 with multiple medical problems walk out of the hospital a week later. So there's some other issue with the transmission and how effective this virus is in causing this autoimmune issue that we have, this immune issue that we have. There's no right answer outside of, we, as cops, by the way, we can't stop serving the public. It's what we do. But it's the simple things. It's masks, it's contact precautions, it's using non-law enforcement people or to handle non-law enforcement issues that the law enforcement officers have traditionally handled. So selecting which engagements we use. But the reality is it's an inherent problem with our profession, as it is a inherent problem with being a physician or anybody in the medical world. We just have to take the right precautions and stay on top of the data.
There's a lot of unknowns with this disease, but we have to keep everybody safe. One of the things we did right away was come up with the policies and procedures with the officers, reducing some of the non-important contacts with the public, limiting some of those type of calls that we normally would go on in person and handle them over the phone. But when we did this, we wanted to utilize social media, we wanted to utilize other platforms to educate the public why we're doing this. We talked about taking more calls over the phone. It wasn't that we didn't want to see the public or we didn't take their calls seriously. We wanted to make sure both sides were protected. Our officers have to be in contact with a lot of people. Social distancing is not always something they can do. When there's a domestic going on, there's times they have to lay hands on people, arrest people, and fight people. We don't know whether they're COVID positive or not at the time. So we wanted to educate the general public of what type of calls we could handle over the phone, what type of calls we could handle in person. And then if we did handle them in person, how we was taking the calls outside of the residence so we didn't track anything inside the residence and either contaminate them or the officers on the calls. So we did a lot of that joint partnership with the community. We also took the other precautions of cleaning the equipment, making sure the guys had their protective equipment that they needed, the masks, the gloves, anything that they had that they needed with hand sanitizer at the time. So a lot of it was trying to reassure them. We talk about stress. Well, this was a big stressor on the officers and the citizens. So we wanted to make sure we tried to reduce that as much as we could. And a lot of that was through education.
One
of the things that we were really ahead of the curve when it came to this COVID-19, we got our mayor, our commissioners, all of our judges, and we just had a game plan. We were like, this thing is coming, so we can't just put our heads in the sand. And so one of the things that we began to do as far as the judicial piece, as far as the inmates in the jail, we began to identify those inmates that were low risk, non-violent, and that were very, very close to completing their sentences. And so what you have to keep in mind when we initially, this COVID-19 initially hit, we had about, our average daily population was about 350. And today's jail population, as far as the average daily population, is about 225. So we were able to release over 100 inmates. And the second piece of that puzzle is when we get an arrestee in, of course, we're checking their temperature. We have designated a dorm for those that cannot burn out, and most of them do burn out. All of the ones that are basically coming in, for the most part, I would say about 95% of them are getting a burn. So, and that's another thing. We're trying to make sure that we keep our jail population down. And just on last week, the mayor and commission voted, they passed the local ordinance that made it mandatory that everybody wear masks. So if you're coming into our community, you've got to have a mask on. So these are some of the steps that we're taking in order to try to stay on top of this COVID-19.
We were able to get the court involved immediately, and the court understood the severity of this situation, and the court allowed us the ability, so if a person is arrested on a simple or serious misdemeanor, no longer are they coming to jail. We're releasing almost all of those people on promises to appear, just to keep that flow of inmates away from the county jail. And anyone that runs a jail knows that it's very much like a care facility. It's probably not the inmates that are going to have COVID to begin with. It's the transient group. It's your employees. It's the visitors. It's people like that. They're going to bring COVID into the facility. So we have shut down visitation. We have no direct contact between the inmates and the outside world. Even the attorneys have to meet with their clients through the glass, through normal visitation procedures. And quite honestly, they're fine with that. That makes sense to them. They don't want to contract or spread this disease any more than anyone else does. So it sounds like our jail is very similar in size to that of Sheriff Edwards, 400-bed facility. We're on an average of about 380. We're also down to about 225 right now, because we were able to lessen the number of people coming into the jail, which also allowed us to do social distancing within the jail itself. We have a varying of both dormitory and lockdown cell situations in our building. And so for inmates that have individual cells, that's all well and good. I mean, they're in their own areas. They can come out as need be. But for the dormitory style cells, one of our larger one has 40 inmates. We needed to establish that social distancing. And so we were able to do that by reducing the number of inmates in that particular dorm by spreading them throughout the facility as well. And we also have areas that are more remotely located in the jail, where we were able to earmark people that may possibly have contracted the disease. We are fortunate, much in the same way that Sheriff Edwards is. I have 0 cases of COVID in my jail right now for inmate population. It's been that way from the beginning. Hopefully it stays that way. And only early on did I have 3 staff members that had COVID. They arrived to work well through the vetting process, became symptomatic while at work, sent them home immediately, tested them, isolated, and thankfully that occurred back in April, and we've had no other contractions since that time. So we're doing everything the same thing that Chief Balling is doing, same thing that Sheriff Edwards is doing. I think it's incumbent on agency administrators to make sure we're doing everything we possibly can to keep our employees and the inmates and the public safe. And anything and everything we do, I think, has been well received. People understand the need for the changes that we have made, and it appears to be working.